Hello guys, and welcome to my Lance guide for the 2.1 update in Vainglory. My name is Excoundrel, and for those of you who don't know me, I am a colour caster in the professional Vainglory esports scene, which means I do a lot of analysis of pro play, and I'm not half bad at Vainglory myself, currently sitting at Pinnacle of Awesome Silver, aiming for Vainglorious though. Now, in 2.1, Lance did have some changes. There were some nerfs to his Githian wall, including a cooldown increase, as well as a stamina cost increase. They did compensate, though, by slightly buffing the stamina cost on his combat roll, so you can still use all three abilities without needing any extra stamina from items. Now, why am I going to talk to you about Lance? Now, I practically played Lance solidly from Rock Solid all the way up to Pinnacle of Awesome Silver in the captain role, and that took me about 3 weeks to get there. Lance is very good in solo queue. He's incredibly tanky, he can actually go offensive when he needs to, and he can set up his teammates incredibly well with the huge amount of CC that he brings to his kit. Now, before we talk about that kit, let's have a look at the base stats, because a lot of people gloss over these, but it is important to know certain things about Lance, because it will affect how you choose to build on him. You can see on the right-hand side of the screen, we can have a look at the health. You can see the health regen, the weapons, the weapon damage there. But the most important thing is his attack speed. It does not scale per level at all, which means whenever you're building an attack speed item, it will only scale from a value of 1, which means as Lance goes throughout the game, you will never get an increase in attack speed through levels, which means those items become less effective. It's why we don't often build attack speed on Lance if you try to build him weapon power. Now, the rest of the stats tell a story too. He's got good movement speed, his range is great due to his lance, but let's look at his defensive stats specifically. He has got, at max level, 2,185 health, and 86 armor and shielding, and those were nerfed. I know, Arden, you were also nerfed in the last patch too, but now Lance is tankier than you naturally. Lance is actually one of the most durable heroes in the game, thanks to those base stats, and it's what makes him so good in solo queue, because you can afford to pick up early offensive items while still having the tenacity of someone like a Finn or an Arden. It's why in the captain role there are multiple different options for you, and I really like Lance for that reason, and it's why, like I said, I think he's very good in the solo queue aspect. Now, I want to talk about Lance's abilities too, so we'll name them and then we'll go over them in more detail as we go along. His heroic perk is known as Partisan's Technique. His A ability is called Impale, in my opinion, the most satisfying ability to hit in the game. His B ability is Githian Wall, that allows him to stun people, knock them away, very good at disengaging, we'll talk about that in more detail too. And his ultimate and C ability is Combat Roll, which gives Lance great mobility post 6 and can get him to dodge over terrain too. So generally Lance has got a little bit of everything built into his kit. Now let's talk about his heroic perk, Partisan's Technique first. Not too much to say here, basically means he can hit multiple targets with one basic attack. Very good for early jungle clear, good for early skirmishes as well. However, it means he's got a slow basic attack animation and attack speed doesn't work as effectively on him. The other part of this heroic perk is to say that his stamina, which is the resource that he uses to cast abilities, is affected by energy regeneration and max energy bought in items. So things like Void Battery, they will have an effect, they are not wasted stats. Now let's look at Impale. Impale is an ability, as most of you will know, that roots when it lands. That root is always 1 second unless you overdrive the ability where it becomes 1.3 seconds. Let's look at the weapon power and crystal power applications of this ability too. Weapon power, very basic, as you would expect. You get 140% scaling damage to heroes with your weapon power ratio, which means it's far better suited if you want to be offensive with this ability, building the weapon power build path. However, there are crystal power applications, 80% damage scaling, but also a 0.15% scaling on the root duration, which means if you pick up, say, a Shatterglass, you should see a significant increase in root duration on Lance's Impale. If you overdrive this ability, it basically resets the cooldown of Combat Roll, which, as you can imagine, you can Combat Roll, Impale, Combat Roll again, or Combat Roll and Githian Wall, for instance. There are many combos you can pull off if you decide to overdrive Impale. Now, I almost always take this ability at level 1, however there are some instances where I would take his B ability, Githyan Wool, but for the most part, if you're playing a standard game, Impale is very solid to take early on. It helps with your jungle clear, and if you are able to be in the aggressive position and are looking to be offensive towards the enemy jungle combo, Impale is fantastic. However, if you're on the defensive, sometimes it's better to have Githyan Wool, which does bring me nicely onto Lance's B ability, known as Githyan Wool, as we've said. It has both passive and active applications. Now, the passive application of Githyan Wool is every time Lance lands a basic attack, he will then strafe that target, holding his shield up, and reduces the damage from that direction by up to 50%, although it starts at 10% and goes up to 20% when you overdrive it. There is a crystal ratio, however, which can get you towards that 50% cap. He has the active application as well, which is the stun, which I'm sure a lot of you have seen. He sweeps them away, knocking enemies in a direction. If that direction is towards a structure or terrain, they get stunned. Now, that stun starts at 0.6 seconds, goes up to 1 second if you overdrive the ability, but can max at 1.6, and that again has a crystal ratio. He also has a very short duration after using the ability where you can actively block a large amount of damage, so it almost acts like a secondary reflex block. So this ability is fantastic in that respect. There are weapon power and crystal power ratios, like I said. The only weapon power ratio is to the damage, which is 100%. However, there are far more crystal applications for Githyan Wool. 80% damage, so a little bit closer than the Impale gap that you see between the two damage ratios. There is a 0.3% scaling on the stun duration and a 15% scaling on the active and passive damage reduction. So picking up a Shattered Glass at the end of your build path, for instance, should be able to hit you towards higher levels of damage reduction and a longer duration stun on Githyan Wool. Now, I always overdrive this ability, and this is because while active, so while you have your active Githyan Wool up, Lance basically ignores all debuffs from any direction. That is huge. It is literally like a secondary reflex block. This ability is always worth overdriving. Brings me nicely onto his combat role, which is his last ability, his ultimate. Now, this is a lot more basic than most other heroes' ultimate abilities. It essentially is what it says on the tin. He rolls. What is more interesting about it, though, is when you have the passive from Githyan Wool and you roll, you maintain that debuff of the passive damage reduction. So you maintain your strafing with the combat roll. The only applications when you level this up is that the cooldown goes down, as does the stamina cost, and after you roll, you get a basic attack that is quicker in animation and deals damage that only scales with crystals. So there is a 60% crystal ratio on Lance's basic attack after the combat roll. There are no weapon power applications here whatsoever. Now, there is a choice between overdriving this or overdriving Impale. You don't get anything fancy when you overdrive the combat roll, like with most ultimates. And if you overdrive Impale, you can reset the cooldown of combat roll. So it's really up to you as to whether you think you're going to be landing your Impales. I often overdrive Impale, so I end up overdriving both Githyan Wool and Impale. But the cooldown reduction on the combat roll and the stamina cost is great for mobility. So you have to assess in a game whether you need the mobility of a combat roll to get to the backline and set things up, or you need to get that longer duration to make picks and give you the extra 0.3 seconds to make those vital kills to help you win the game. So it's an interesting way up here. I generally overdrive Impale, like I said, but sometimes I do also overdrive combat roll. Now, as we come towards the end of Lance's abilities, there are a couple of interesting extras that you might not know about. Lance's basic attack range is listed as 4.5 meters, but if you can hit something at the very end of that range, you can hit targets up to 5 meters away. So the very end of Lance's spear can hit targets beyond his basic attack range, can be useful when trying to snipe an enemy past a minion or something of that sort. He also halts his stamina regeneration on the ability animations of Impale and combat roll, but not on Githyan Wool. So when you combat roll and Impale, you won't regenerate stamina. You have to wait until those animations go through. It just kind of plays into his combo a little bit, so that sometimes you can't quite get multiple combos off, because when you Impale, that's a long animation and the stamina goes down. These are just all small things, though. They shouldn't have too much impact in your overall gameplay. Now let's look at Lance's starting items, because this is for the Captain build path. We will talk mainly about support items, but we will also touch on his more aggressive build paths later on too. He has 5 major starting items to work with: the Weapon Blade, the Oak Heart, the Iron Guard Contract, Flare, and Halcyon Potion. Now, the most versatile and my most common starting build path is Weapon Blade, Iron Guard Contract, and Flare. Weapon Blade gives you huge early damage on your Impale, helps with the jungle clear for your jungler, Iron Guard Contract for the sustain, and Flare is useful in almost every situation. I cannot name a situation where Flare is not useful early on. Spying the enemy jungler, keeping your laner safe, getting a sort of a surprise Impale, it's a great item to have. Oakheart and Iron Guard Contract are interchangeable. This is a more duel-heavy build path that I like to take. High early shielding and armor means Oakheart works very well for Lance. This is if you're looking to brawl and brawl consistently and you're trying to survive longer than the enemy on your opposite number. You could also take out the Weapon Blade. Now, this is a super defensive build. If you are not going to be on the offensive, you are mainly just looking to keep your jungler safe, stay away from trouble, this is the most defensive build path I think you could potentially take. There is the interchangeable option of the Potion and the Flare. The Potion is a super safe start. If you have the Iron God Contract, I wouldn't recommend that you need it, but if you really want to, there is the option for the Potion, although I would always say that Flare is a better choice. So now we've looked at starting items, we need to look at where to go from here. And one of the main things that I want to point out in terms of build paths is that because Vainglory is so fluid, the build paths are quite fluid as well. You will find yourself building a lot of the same things, but from time to time you may have to adjust your build path depending on who you're facing, and it's good to know what each individual item does and why it is relevant. Now, one of the first big items is Fountain. 99% of the time, this should be your first item choice on any captain, let alone Lance. The only time that you might go against that is with a Crucible, but I will talk about that later. Fountain is a fantastic item. You get health regeneration out of combat, you get an active regeneration in a teamfight situation, as well as shielding, armor, and max health. I cannot praise this item enough. It should be your first point of call in almost every situation. Now, for Lance, he really likes his mobility. Picking up early tier 1 boots is very important. You will eventually look to build those into war treads. In the later stages of the game, you will want your team to follow up on your Impale plays and your Githian walls. War treads will allow them to do so. It's a really good item in the later game. Flare Gun is ridiculous. It gives you a constant supply of flares and builds into Contraption, which gives you the scout traps too. Cannot praise this item enough. Flare Gun in the early game, think about Contraption later on if you can afford it. If you're going up against a weapon power carry, you need to buy armor as Lance. Even though he's got good scaling armor in his own right, picking up a coat of plates will make you very tanky versus that specific target, especially with that active and passive damage reduction from Githian Wall. And because of Lance's mobility, you can go towards Atlas Pauldrons, which slow attack speed. Also have a look at your items on the right there. The Nullwave Gauntlet, that's very, very good against shutting down the enemy roamer or the enemy captain. Good with burst on your team. You can blow people up before Fountain can even get activated. And Crucible, that's the item that I would sometimes consider picking up first against people like a Finn or Adagio when I think at level 6 it's absolutely necessary that I have that item. I generally go Crucible second, so I will go Fountain, tier 1 boots, whatever, and then Crucible. That is a very solid item choice. Scout traps, buy them, guys. Buy them in the early game, put them all over the map. Whenever I go to base, I pick up 2 scout traps. It's so important to have that level of vision on the Halcyon Fold. And if you aren't able to get the flare gun, try and pick up at least 2 flares every time you back as well, because honestly, flares will be an absolute lifesaver in certain situations. Can't actually praise vision enough on this, guys. Vision is a real game winner. And if there's one thing about your game that you want to improve, it should be looking to improve your vision in general. Now, that is sort of the generic captain items. I did talk to you earlier about some alternative items that Lance has, and that's kind of like the aggressive build paths, and also some other items that you might consider picking up. What I often do is upgrade my Weapon Blade into 6 Sins, and that gives me options. Now, I can put 6 Sins into a Tension Bow. If I go towards a Tension Bow, then I'm essentially expecting to do kind of more burst damage, but I could also put it towards a Sorrow Blade. A lot of people praise the Sorrow Blade over Tension Bow because it gives you a more sustained source of damage, and obviously the higher weapon power scales so nicely with the Impale as well. I like both of them. I think they're individual depending on the game you're playing. I do think that Tension Bow is great as the game progresses because you can hit multiple people with that on-hit attack. You might also look to consider a Shatterglass in the late game. We talked about what it does in the ability section. It gives you lots of CP scales with your kit. If you're not able to get close to their weapon power carry and you're doing a lot of peeling, you might consider a Full Metal Jacket instead of an Atlas Pauldrons. And remember guys, your infusions are super important too. If you want to do a bit more burst, pick up the weapon infusion, it doesn't really have any kind of overall effect on your kit because it's just mainly for damage. Also, you could consider the Crystal Infusion, which will give you stun duration, root duration, and increased damage on all of your abilities. Again, kind of situational. If you're doing a lot of damage and you want to kind of aggress on the game, I often go weapon. Although sometimes I do end up going crystal just because I want that kind of utility from the stuns and root duration. And you still get a little bit of a damage increase as well as having the damage increase on your combat roll too. So again, very situational depending on what you would like to achieve from your infusion. I often find that weapon helps you close out the game, but if you're going into the later stages of the game, I would always say that crystal is better because it has more applications. So I promised you some sample build paths. Let's have a look at them now. The captain build path for me has always been quite straightforward. I always go fountain, I pick up boots quite early on. I often like to get a very early flare gun too. I will then eventually build into a crucible, generally a second item, and then it kind of opens up for me. Got whole hosts of item choices if you've built a coat of plates towards Atlas Pauldrons, Contraption, Nullwave Gauntlet, War Treads obviously, and even Storm Crown to consider when looking to take a lot of neutral objectives like the Kraken. Now, I did promise you also a carry build path, so let's have a look here. Lance does not love attack speed, so I often go for things that don't synergize heavily with attack speed. Sorrowblade, boots, tension bow, and then you could even move into something like an Aftershock or a Storm Crown depending on what you want. On hit, Lance is actually quite effective, but remember you need defense. You are not unkillable. Even with your high base stats, you do need to prioritize some defense. Full Metal Jacket, Atlas Pauldrons, Aegis, all of these are very viable defense options for a carry Lance. And that is it. That is my Lance guide for you right now. I am streaming on twitch.tv/Excoundrel. I do try and stream most days, but weekends I generally have off. Check out my Twitter, twitter.com/Excoundrel, and also don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment. And tell me what guide you would like to see next, because I'll try and work on another one next week. And I'd love to see and hear your guys' thoughts. I will try and do the best that I can for the heroes that I know well. But I hope you enjoyed my first guide. It was, wow, we were looking at almost 17 minutes plus here. It's been really fantastic. Thank you so much, guys, for watching if you made it this far. And I hope you found it useful in some way.